Welcome to Witham Sounding Board, a podcast sharing powerful business tips, insights, and trends for those seeking to become a rock star in their industry.
We are back at it again for another edition of Hot Topics. I'm your host, Aaron Slaughter, and we thought it made sense to round out this mini-series on the DOL, CAP, and ICAP audits on what next. Ashley Hall and Dave Dorsey, our two partner experts out of Washington, D.C., will close us out today on just what to expect at the end of your investigation and where to go from. So I'll start us off. We've done the investigation. We've complied with requests. We've answered questions. We've had some responses. Some months have gone by, maybe. And we're at the point now where we're ready to put a bow and close this chapter in our lives. What is the end result of an investigation like this? What are we expecting to see? Is there a letter that we're going to see? Will we get a phone call? What happens next?
Yeah, Aaron. So for CAP audits, ultimately it culminates in what's called a closing letter. All closing letters are public information, so it gets posted to the OLMS website, the Office of Labor Management Standards website. But the good news is that the union folks are going to have an opportunity to see a draft of that letter before it gets posted. And that's the opportunity that unions can have to either provide information that they've subsequently found or answer a potential finding. And it's possible that they'd be able to remove something that the investigator is planning to report on. So it's not guaranteed, but the point is that the unions are going to know what the investigator is planning to report on and have one more opportunity to comment before that gets finalized and published. But Aaron, that's ultimately the end of the process is that letter. And once it gets posted, that investigation is closed. The only exception to that would be in cases where the investigation resulted in a lot of findings or severe findings or a combination of two. We have seen in some cases where that investigator will follow back up in about 6 months or so in order to see that the union has taken remedial action on those findings and things have changed to prevent them from happening again. So that's not the case in every investigation. That would be up to the investigators to determine whether that follow-up is appropriate, but we have seen that happen in some instances.
So, Dave, this is something that I've heard you talk about in various settings, just about the way these letters are written and just the connotation, the syntax, the feel and overall connotation of the letter itself. Is there something that goes to the members? Are there instances where you need to get out in front of this? Like, is there anything that you can do from a union standpoint to essentially do damage control?
Well, there's nothing you can really do about the letter itself. As Ash mentioned, it's available publicly on the Department of Labor website. And they're listed there by year. If you just Google compliance audits, you will see those sorted by union affiliation and then by the date that it was issued. And so getting out ahead of it, I think, can be a positive thing, letting your members know what's going on, letting your members know what they found and what you're planning to do about it. I think that's all wonderful to do. And that way you've socialized it. So if it happens to come up during a membership meeting, you can say, oh, yeah, we covered that a couple months ago. And we're glad that they finally put that to bed and we can move on with other things. I think sometimes candidates that are considering running against incumbents might use those letters to embarrass people, which is too bad. You know, everybody makes mistakes, but because of the way they're written, it's just not a very favorable light that gets painted. So there's not much you can do about it other than try to stay positive, try to encourage, be transparent with your membership, and always try to improve what you do and what your union does.
Thank you for that. As you know, we try to anticipate what the listeners are here for. I'll ask $1 million question. Are there any fines or penalties associated with these letters?
Not the letters themselves. The only time you'll have fines or penalties assessed will be in cases where there are issues of noncompliance that are associated with fines and penalties. So it's not the investigation itself, but look, the labor laws if you go look at the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, there are certain violations of that law that can trigger penalties and fines and prosecution and things. So it would only be if that level of finding is discovered in the process, but not an automatic from a closing letter.
Yeah, and so if you were to look at the law, references often $10,000 per event and or a year in prison. I think that's to get people's attention. I think in reality, that does not come out for the most part unless there's people stealing money or people being willfully negligent in what they're doing. But for someone that can't find a few credit card receipts, I totally agree with Ash is that they're not going to receive a fine or anything like that. They're just going to get a let's try to do a better next time letter, but it won't be worded as kindly.
Okay. So as we sit here today and we've spent some time talking about what these CAP audits are. We've talked about just some common areas that you'll find in the findings. And here we talk about what happens at the end and really what next. Are there things that unions can do to prepare themselves when they find themselves on the wrong end of a DOL investigation?
Point that you've gotten the letter, you can go through your documents knowing based on what we've talked about in these few episodes or resources online. You can look through what you can expect for them to be looking at and look at the documentation before you send it over. But at that point, I mean, it's in some regards, it's too late. And so what I suggest is that unions take some precautionary measures just to check on the health of their union and its compliance with these things now before they would ever get this letter to show up.
I mean, that makes sense to me. We talk about this often as a group. It's easier to do some preventative measures than it is to get out of certain lawsuits. So that definitely makes sense to me. Are there any things that you would suggest? Are there things that their external auditors can do or just questions that they can ask in order to help better prepare themselves when they find themselves receiving this type of letter?
Yes, there are several things that unions can do. I suggest that they do it internally, or if they're going to use an external or an outside source or consultant, just make sure it's with a firm that's well-versed in labor union law, specifically in that industry, because the requirements for labor organizations are pretty odd and unique. But what you can do, whether you bring in an outside firm to do it or you do it yourself, is to check a few things. For example, unions can check their policies, and not only that they're adhering to DOL and labor law requirements, but that they're following their own policies. So some of those may merit some updating and then re-educating of the officers and employees. Some of the maybe policies I suggest to put at the top of that fresh look list would be anything around officer and employee expenses, travel, record retention, auto usage, and documentation. Those are the ones I'd start with. Another thing that you can do is make sure that you're properly bonded. It's a pretty straightforward calculation. I think it's a good thing to get in the habit of doing that around LM2 season every year, but certainly making sure that you have the rights and sufficient bonding coverage is an easy one to check. Another thing that is good to refresh, and this you can do with external financial auditors also, is to look at internal control processes to make sure there's a strong system of segregation of duties and documentation, even in small organizations. I think it's helpful to understand that the DOL sees union officials as occupying positions of trust, right? They are considered fiduciaries, and they're responsible for making sure that union funds are used solely for the benefit of unions and members. And internal controls is a really important way to make sure that those funds are properly safeguarded for that purpose, for the purpose of being used for unions and members. So some of the things that they might be looking for that's good for unions to check in on is that there's good documentation for the receipts coming in, that there's support for receipts and disbursements, that there's a separation as much as possible with those handling funds and those according to the membership database, that whoever's doing the bank reconciliations is different than who else is looking at the bank statements each month. Just that there's things in place and safeguards to make sure that union funds are being protected and safeguarded. So that's a few things. Of course, they're going to be looking for documentation for credit card expenses, employee reimbursements. So I would definitely take a look and see how any union, how those records look. Is all the documentation there? Is it meeting the DOL expectations? And look, if it's not, just as soon as possible, get the education out there on what's expected and help officers and employees become compliant with that as soon as possible.
Yeah, and perhaps a few other things to think about is the Department of Labor actually has some pretty useful compliance tip sheets on their website. I really think it's a good little library of things to sort of kind of compare your own policies to see whether or not you're following their expectations, whether you're paying lost time or whether you have a credit card that you happen to have in the name of the union, those kinds of things. So I think that's a good check. And the second thing I wanted to say is that the types of transactions that tend to lead to issues, there's been a number of them involving officer paid leave. And so if you compensate your officers for vacation or sick time or so forth, let's just make sure that those records are buttoned up good and tight, and we have documentation that's consistent for everybody in the organization, not just the employees, but the officers also need to be tracked in a way that provides documentation for the leave that they take as well. And I think the last thing, and not all unions maybe could afford to do this, but we have a number of clients ask us to sort of simulate what the Department of Labor does. And so we come in advance and do many of the same kinds of things that the government would do, and then provide them a report. And from that report, they can start to self-assess where they need to make changes, what they might need to improve. And that gives them sort of a report card before the doorbell rings and the government's on the doorstep asking you to come in and do the same thing.
Those are all great tips. And just going back to your point really fast, Dave, how expensive or inexpensive is that simulated audit that you mentioned? Is it something that's going to break the bank, or is it something that's pretty reasonable? Can you speak at all to that?
Depends on how big your bank is. I would tell you this, that we've done a number of these recently. I think the tone in DC has caused unions to be on edge, and some of them are mid 5 figures, depending on the depth of the complexity. Others are low 5 figures if it's a small union. One way to kind of control this cost, which I recommend, is rather than say to a firm like ours or somebody else, hey, look, we want you to do a full simulation of what the government would do. Because remember, the government has no timeline. They can take as long as they want. And so if you have a firm come in and replicate that, it could literally bust your bank account. Maybe do something like this. Say to them, I'm going to engage you to spend 2 or 3 days and just look at the areas that you think are most likely to be concerns. And then at the end of 3 days, sit down and tell us what you found. And that way the union can have a budget that they can come up with ahead of time. We know exactly what it's going to cost. The CPA firm understands the commitment of their effort, and everybody wins because it's more economical to do it that way. And they can end up with that whole, 80-20 concept that 80% of our issues are going to be in 20% of the areas. And so that's where a firm would focus on. So that's my suggestion there.
That's great. Well, I certainly learned a lot in these last 3 episodes. But for all of our listeners out there, I hope you did as well. You know the story. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you'll be first in line to hear what's coming next. Don't want to wait for our next episode? Check us out at withum.com. That's WITHUM.com.